The calendar reads June 10th, 1692. High upon a desolate rocky ridge overlooking the settlement of Salem, the carpenters have finally laid down their hammers, their grim assignment complete. A wooden scaffold rises stark and terrible against the gloomy grey of the morning sky. There will be no church bells ringing out in hope here today. No sweet hymns of grace will echo off these hills. This structure was raised for one purpose and one purpose only: it exists for death. Standing in the ominous shadow of the gallows waits Bridget Bishop. She is not quiet. She is loud. She is defiant. She is draped in colours that scream against the drab landscape, making her pious neighbours whisper in judgment. For years, her fierce independence and refusal to bow to social norms has been a silent slap in the face to everyone around her, a thorn in the side of a rigid society. But right now, that insult is about to cost her everything she has. These Puritans claim they serve the Most High God above all things. But today, they are about to prove that their deepest loyalty belongs to a much darker master. It is the spirit of fear, the overwhelming terror that the adversary Satan himself is walking among them, wearing the familiar faces of their friends and family. When the trapdoor opens and Bridget drops, Salem is going to shatter a spiritual boundary that can never be repaired. The accusations will no longer just float around the village as idle gossip. They are going to fall like heavy stones, turning into death sentences. Fear is becoming the official policy of the land. The rope is becoming the standard for punishment. For generations, the history books have offered us comfortable, easy explanations. They call it religious hysteria. They call it mass delusion. They tell us it was just a bunch of superstitious peasants losing their minds in the wilderness. But let me tell you, the comfortable explanations are almost always a lie. When you look closer at what really went down in Salem, the truth is enough to turn your stomach. You find a village ripped apart by two warring factions fighting like wolves over land influence and political power. You find a people who are survivors of brutal Native American raids, men and women who still wake up screaming from nightmares of burning homes and butchered families. You find the marginalized daughters and servants trapped at the very bottom of a crushing hierarchy where their voices meant absolutely nothing, until suddenly their whispers became the most powerful weapon in town. You find preachers and judges weaponizing the holy scriptures in courtrooms that look more like torture chambers than halls of justice. This is exactly how intelligent, faithful, God-fearing people convince themselves that their next-door neighbors are soaring through the darkness on invisible wings, tormenting the innocent and signing their souls over in blood to the devil himself. In this broadcast, we are going to tear the story of Salem open layer by layer and expose the root of the evil. We are going to trace this madness from its origin: restless young girls experimenting with forbidden fortune-telling in the cold kitchen of a parsonage. We will follow the trail into the interrogation rooms, where the accused stood no chance against a system rigged for their destruction. We will make the climb up Gallows Hill as the bodies of the condemned swing in the stifling summer heat. And we will witness the hollow, empty apologies that arrived years too late to save a single soul. By the time we are done, you will understand that nothing about this witch hunt was an accident. It was a machine constructed from ancient resentments, fresh wounds, and leaders who found it much easier to kill their opposition than to question their own hearts. Before we go any deeper into this darkness, drop a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. And if you haven't smashed that subscribe button yet, now is the time to do it. You are watching the realest deep dive history content on the planet. To truly understand how a public execution could ever feel justified to a community, you have to go back years before the rope ever touches Bridget Bishop's throat. You have to understand that Salem was not one happy unified community. It was two completely different worlds grinding against each other like tectonic plates. On the coastline you had Salem town. It was prosperous, it was noisy, and it was built on the hustle of harbors and foreign trade. Its streets were humming with merchants counting their profits, sailors spending their wages, and ambitious men who measured their success in gold coins rather than prayers. Then inland, surrounded by stubborn fields and the dark, forbidding forest, sat Salem village. It was smaller, it was poorer, and it was deeply suspicious of everything happening down by the water. The villagers were farmers breaking their backs against the rocky soil just to survive. They watched the coastal merchants grow fat on timber and sugar trade while they hauled firewood-birthed calves in freezing barns and fought against winters that seemed to hate them personally. Salem Village answered to Salem Town for both their taxes and their religion, creating a master-servant dynamic. They paid into a system that completely ignored them and were forced to sit beneath ministers they never truly chose for themselves. Year after year, that feeling of powerlessness curdled into a silent, boiling fury. And inside the village itself, that fury split the people into two armed camps. On one side, you had the Putnam clan and their allies. These were the old blood, the large landholders, the gatekeepers. They were fiercely traditional. They wanted their own church, their own legal standing, and a return to the pure hardline Puritan ways their grandparents had walked in. On the other side, you had the Porters and their web of relatives and business partners gathering their strength. The Porters had the money. They had the connections to the coastal economy. They were investing in mills, shipping, and what they called progress. To the Putnams, the Porters looked like greedy traders who were selling out their ancestors for a quick buck. To the Porters, the Putnams looked like bitter, jealous men who were terrified of tomorrow. This was not a polite disagreement, it was a war fought with lawsuits and property lines. In the 1670s, the Putnams dragged the Porters to court over a dam and a sawmill, claiming the new construction was flooding Putnam fields just to fatten Porter pockets. Boundary markers were challenged in the dead of night. Inheritance claims were contested in bitter legal battles. Every argument over a fence post or a stream became another festering wound that never had a chance to heal. And right at the heart of this battlefield stood the village church. Whoever controlled the pulpit controlled the very soul of the community. Each faction schemed and plotted to install their own minister to push their agenda. Preachers arrived and fled in waves, unable to handle the bitterness. One left over unpaid salary, another over disputes about firewood, another was driven out by a hostile group that simply refused to support him, starving him out of the pulpit. By the time the calendar turned to 1692, Salem Village had gained a notorious reputation throughout the region as a stronghold of division that simply could not cease from tearing itself apart. The spiritual atmosphere over that land was toxic, a poisoned ground where paranoia reigned supreme and every neighbor was watching the other with a suspicious eye, nursing grudges something as trivial as a dead livestock animal or a broken wheel on a cart was enough to reignite bitter arguments that had been simmering for 2 decades. The meeting house, which should have been a sanctuary, binding the body of believers together, transformed into a theater of silent, seething hostility. It became a game of surveillance where families kept a mental ledger of who sat in which pew, who nodded in agreement during specific sermons, and who seemed a little too friendly with the wrong crowd. This was the fertile soil the enemy was waiting for, a garden of bitterness perfectly prepared for the first whispers of witchcraft to take root and spread like wildfire. When the demonic accusations finally erupted, they didn't strike the town at random. They followed the deep, jagged fault lines that had already been carved into the village by years of fleshly conflict. The ringleaders of the accusation and their most vocal supporters emerged from the Putnam clan, representing the conservative West, the hard-working farming families who felt they were losing their grip on the culture. On the other side, many of the people they targeted and named as witches had deep ties, either by marriage or financial dealings, to the Porter family and the wealthy trade-connected elite of the East. You have to understand that the witchcraft outbreak in Salem was not simply a manifestation of the fear of the devil or religious hysteria. It was an ancient civil war within the community that had been given terrifying new ammunition to destroy opponents. But petty local feuds alone cannot explain the massive scale of the darkness that followed. While the Putnams and Porters were busy glaring at each other across their property lines, a much larger, darker nightmare was unfolding just to the north that would change everything. In the year 1689, a brutal conflict known to the colonists as King William's War broke out, shaking the foundations of the New England settlements. French forces, aligned with their indigenous allies, launched devastating raids against English settlements in territories like Maine and New Hampshire, which were under the governance of Massachusetts at the time. We are not talking about distant skirmishes that folks read about in the newspaper weeks later. These were terrifying midnight attacks on isolated families who had no warning. Entire households were slaughtered before the sun could even rise. Homes were reduced to piles of ash and children were dragged away screaming into captivity in the wilderness. Whole villages were literally erased from the map between sunset and sunrise, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. The survivors who managed to escape fled south carrying nothing on their backs but absolute horror, dragging their deep trauma into any community that would open its doors to shelter them. Essex County, where Salem was situated, became a refugee camp for these shattered souls. And Salem Village, despite its own internal fractures, absorbed a number of these traumatized people. They brought with them graphic stories of sudden massacres, relatives being hacked apart in front of their eyes, and brutal forced marches through the freezing cold as prisoners of war. These refugees slept in borrowed corners, ate at borrowed tables, and poured their nightmares into every conversation, infecting the village with a spirit of fear. Their very presence was a living, breathing reminder that the wilderness just beyond the cleared fields was crawling with enemies waiting to strike. The Puritan theology of the day interpreted all of this through a brutal spiritual lens, seeing the physical war as a manifestation of a spiritual battle. To them, the native enemies were not merely political opponents fighting for land. They were viewed as spiritual adversaries sent to test the faithful. Many colonists consumed captivity narratives that described indigenous ceremonies as literal devil worship, painting the native warriors as actual servants of Satan himself. Consequently, military defeat was read as divine judgment from the Most High. If the raids were succeeding, it meant the colony had sinned, and hidden corruption inside the community had weakened its spiritual armor. Under that strict logic, the answer to the disaster happening on the frontier was not just building stronger forts or gathering more gunpowder. The answer was stricter holiness at home. The people were told that victory on the frontier required a radical purging of sin in their own streets to get right with God. The belief was that secret evil living among them was the open door inviting real tomahawks and real bullets to destroy their families. In that charged atmosphere, a witch hunt morphed into something resembling a military operation, a desperate search for spiritual traitors whose invisible crimes were believed to be costing real human lives. It is no coincidence that some of the most active accusers came from families who were carrying the trauma of this war directly inside their own walls. Take Mercy Lewis, for example, the servant to the Putnams. She had lost her family in a brutal raid and survived as a refugee before finding her way to Salem Village. She slept under the Putnam roof and spent her nights whispering terrifying stories of slaughter and bloodshed. These stories were poured into the ears of their daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., who would grow up to become one of the loudest and most destructive voices in the crisis. For a child raised alongside such horrific testimony, the idea that Satan's agents were living nearby was not some abstract theology. It felt like an obvious, terrifying reality. Into this scarred, furious, and paranoid village walked the man who would pour fuel on the flames while fully believing he was defending heaven, Reverend Samuel Parris. He arrived on the scene in 1689, right as the war was raging and the village feud was burning white hot. Parris had previously tried to build a fortune as a merchant in Barbados and Boston, but he had failed miserably. He was a man desperate for respect, financial security, and clear authority, things he felt he had been denied in his previous life. But Salem Village was not the kind of place that would offer him any of those things without a fight. From his very first days, he clashed with his congregation over money and social status. He argued constantly about his salary. He fought over whether he would hold the title to the parsonage, demanding ownership rather than just residence. He even argued about his firewood allotment. In a community that was already suspicious of greed, his obsession with material security made him look worldly, grasping, and self-serving. The Porter faction, which was already connected to the coastal merchant class, turned against him fast and refused to pay their share of his financial support. Parris did not respond with wisdom or diplomacy. Instead, he dug trenches and prepared for spiritual war against his own flock. He interpreted their opposition not as a political disagreement, but as a direct spiritual assault on his authority. His sermons grew dark and menacing. He began to preach from the pulpit that Satan had infiltrated the church, declaring that enemies of God were hiding right there within the congregation. Anyone who dared to stand against him was immediately labeled as part of a demonic, invisible assault on his authority. To the people supporting him, he successfully framed every minor disagreement and petty argument as a literal holy war between good and evil. It was a binary world of spiritual warfare. You either stood with the man of God, or you were unknowingly serving the devil's agenda. His twisted theology made this dangerous interpretation incredibly easy for his followers to swallow. Reverend Parris operated under the delusion that he was shepherding a tiny exclusive circle of visible saints, a remnant chosen by God surrounded on all sides by a wicked and corrupt generation. He viewed his church as a fragile fortress of light, drowning in a vast ocean of darkness. With every dispute over his salary contract or every refusal to pay church taxes, he didn't see economics. He saw confirmation that the kingdom of darkness was actively pushing back against his ministry. You have to understand his mindset. He wasn't arguing about firewood or supplies. In his spirit, he believed he was fighting for the very soul of the village. Long before any supernatural manifestation occurred in his own home, he had already surrendered to the spirit of paranoia, convinced that Satan was actively plotting to destroy him. Now, living right in the middle of this spiritual pressure cooker were three young females whose lives were about to ignite a catastrophe that we are still analyzing in 2026. You had his daughter Betty, his niece Abigail Williams, and in a position of extreme vulnerability, his enslaved servant Tituba. Betty was just a young child growing up under the crushing weight of religious perfectionism, watched like a hawk by the entire village simply because she was the minister's offspring. Abigail was older, carrying her own heavy baggage. She had likely witnessed the brutal slaughter of her own parents during a frontier raid and was now forced to live as a dependent of an uncle whose sermons were constantly dripping with judgment and hellfire. Both of these girls existed under a system of rigid, suffocating rules. There was almost no freedom, zero time for play. Just a constant rhythmic drumbeat of fear regarding sin, eternal damnation, and the looming threat of the devil. Then there was Tituba, an enslaved woman Parris had dragged with him all the way from the Caribbean, likely carrying the bloodline of indigenous Arawak or African ancestry. In the judgmental eyes of white New England, she was an outsider twice over foreign by the color of her skin and foreign by the culture she carried in her spirit. She held on to her own memories of Barbados, her own spiritual beliefs, and the stories that had been passed down to her ancestors. To these anxious girls trapped in a spiritually suffocating household, spending time in the kitchen with Tituba must have felt like breathing pure oxygen. Here, away from the stern gaze of the pulpit, there was gossip, there was storytelling, and eventually there were forbidden games. One of those games was simple, cheap, and spiritually lethal in the Puritan world they lived in. It was fortune-telling, a direct violation of their religious laws. During the freezing winter of 1691, transitioning into 1692, a small circle of girls began gathering in the Parris kitchen. It was Betty, Abigail, and Putnam Jr., and a few others seeking answers. They utilized an old English folk technique known as the Venus glass. You simply crack an egg and let the egg white drift into a glass of water. The goal was to interpret the shapes formed by the swirling patterns, looking for prophetic signs of your future, specifically the trade or social status of your future husband. Now, for the average English villager, this was half joke and half hope, just a bit of harmless folk magic. But for strict fundamentalist Puritans, this was deadly serious business. Trying to peer into the future through magical means was not a game to them. It was a rebellious attempt to bypass the will of the Most High. It was essentially an open invitation to the devil. For the minister's own daughter and niece to be practicing this under his roof was like striking a match inside a room filled with gunpowder. According to the historical accounts that surfaced later, this little game took a terrifying and supernatural turn. One of the girls believed she saw something other than a tool or a trade floating in that egg white. She saw the distinct shape of a coffin, a sign of death rather than marriage. In a world that already believed it was under siege by invisible enemies, seeing that image of death must have landed on their spirits like a physical blow. They knew they had broken a divine rule, and now a symbol of death was floating right before their eyes. Absolute fear took possession of the atmosphere. Shortly after this event, Betty and Abigail began manifesting strange and disturbing symptoms. They would scream out loud without any warning or provocation. They twisted their bodies into unnatural, contorted positions and complained of being tormented by invisible pain. They crawled underneath the furniture, barked like wild animals, and appeared to be struck and beaten by unseen hands. In a household dominated by sermons about Satan's power, the adults could only come to one conclusion: the devil had breached the walls. At first, they tried to keep this as a private family crisis. But you know how small towns are. Neighbors arrived, they watched, and they whispered. One church member, Mary Sibley, suggested utilizing a piece of counter magic to fight back. Her suggestion exposed the deep spiritual hypocrisy and contradiction buried inside Puritan New England. On the surface, their official theology rejected all magic as satanic. But underneath, ordinary people were still quietly using old charms and folk remedies to get by. Sibley instructed John Indian Parris's other enslaved servant to bake what was known as a witch cake. This involved mixing rye meal with the afflicted girl's urine, bake it in the ashes, and feed it to a dog. The occult belief was that whatever witch had projected her spirit into the girls had left a mystical trace of herself inside their physical bodies. The theory was that the dog, by consuming the cake, would become mystically linked to the witch and cause her intense physical pain, forcing her to reveal her identity. It was a desperate, chaotic attempt to drag the invisible enemy out into the open. When Reverend Parris discovered what had been done with his daughter's urine in his own kitchen, he absolutely erupted. To him, this wasn't a clever investigation or a remedy. It was direct collaboration with the devil using cursed tools to fight a cursed enemy. His fury transformed what was a private household drama into a public accusation that would shake the foundations of the colony. The question shifted instantly. It was no longer what is happening to these girls. The question became who is attacking them, and someone had to answer for it. Under immense pressure from Parris and the other adults, the girls were pushed to name names. The witch cake had promised to reveal a culprit, and the community was now bloodthirsty, demanding a sacrifice. They needed a scapegoat, and they weren't going to stop until they found one. When we look at the spiritual warfare that took place, the first 3 names called out were not chosen by accident. There was a demonic strategy behind targeting Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. The enemy always targets the most vulnerable first. These were the weakest vessels in the village, women who were already rejected and despised by the community for various reasons. Tituba stood out specifically as the enslaved foreigner, the woman of color stripped of her heritage. She was completely isolated in that system, having no family lineage to back her up, absolutely zero legal standing, and no spiritual covering or protection from the powers that be. Then you had Sarah Good, a sister dealing with homelessness and extreme poverty, wandering from house to house, begging for crumbs, and when the religious folks shut the door in her face, she'd speak bitterness, which they conveniently labeled as witchcraft. The community had already marked her as a curse. If a cow got sick or the milk went sour, they didn't look at their own stewardship. They pointed the finger straight at the woman they despised in their hearts. Sarah Osborne was the third target, an elderly woman battling sickness who dared to break the unwritten rules of their society by taking a young lover, marrying beneath her station, and trying to protect her assets from her own ungrateful sons. She stopped bowing down to their religious system, rarely showing up for their Sunday services. And she was caught up in messy lawsuits with the powerful Putnam family, making her a prime political target. By pointing the finger at these specific women, the entities manipulating those children chose victims that nobody in the village would stand up and fight for. It was a calculated move to establish a foothold of fear without resistance. When the chains went on them in late February, the atmosphere shifted immediately. We watched private paranoia get codified into public legislation, a pattern of control we still see operating today. The so-called agents of justice magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin kicked off the official Inquisition on March 1st, 1692. The town hall was packed to the rafters with onlookers hungry for drama, while the young accusers put on a theatrical display of demonic manifestation right on schedule. These women were bombarded with entrapment questions. While Good and Osborne stood their ground and refused to bow to the lie, the system focused its full weight and pressure on Tituba. Think about her position. She was property owned by the very preacher claiming to speak for God, totally isolated and culturally distinct from her oppressors in every single way. Hathorne didn't even pretend to seek the truth or ask if she was innocent. He bypassed due process and went straight to demanding to know why she was tormenting these babies and which demon she was in covenant with. If she said no, they called her a liar. If she hesitated to think, they called it proof of guilt. There was no winning in their corrupt court system. What they don't tell you in the sterilized history books is that behind the scenes, Reverend Parris was physically beating her into submission, demanding she validate their narratives. Broken, bleeding, and cornered with no way out, she made a brilliant tactical move for self-preservation. She started to nod her head, but she didn't just give a simple confession to satisfy them. She spun a complex web of narratives talking about supernatural transport on poles, communicating with animal familiars, and cutting deals with a mysterious... She painted vivid pictures of spectral entities, a black hound, a crimson cat, and a yellow bird feeding the superstitions that were already festering in their minds. She described a tall, dark figure from Boston dressed in black, perfectly mirroring the Puritan paranoia about a centralized satanic hierarchy orchestrating the attack from the shadows. She spoke of the Devil's Ledger, a book of covenants, where souls signed their allegiance, claiming she saw the signatures of Good Osborne and many others written in blood. It was a masterclass in psychology. She mixed their own European folklore with just enough exotic flavor to terrify them and make the lie believable to their prejudiced ears. Then she flipped the script and started manifesting symptoms herself, acting as if she were under spiritual attack right there in the courtroom to blend in with the accusers. She cried out that the specters of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were retaliating against her, for snitching, punishing her for exposing the coven to the authorities. In real time, she shifted the narrative from being a perpetrator to being a victim, a move that undoubtedly kept her from the gallows while the others perished. But for the judges, her life was secondary. What mattered was that she gave them the confirmation bias they craved. She validated their worst fears and gave them a reason to expand their control. She proved to them that this wasn't just a couple of crazy women. This was a highly organized, systemic, satanic conspiracy operating in their midst, threatening their entire way of life. She planted the seed that there were sleeper agents everywhere, hidden names in the book, that the authorities hadn't even suspected yet, creating a state of perpetual panic. The narrative exploded from dealing with 3 marginalized outcasts to fighting an invisible colony-wide network of evil that could be anyone, anywhere. Tituba's testimony broke the dam. The girls' convulsions were no longer seen as medical issues or tantrums, but as prophetic evidence. Suddenly, these children were viewed as spiritual radar receiving intel directly from the front lines of a demonic war that the adults couldn't see. The magistrates began to view themselves not as civil servants, but as holy warriors on the front lines, and they started filling the jails with fresh warrants based on spectral evidence. Citizens were dragged in to face the screaming accusers, and the machinery of persecution began to grind forward a mechanism that wouldn't stop crushing lives for many months. A foolish game played in a kitchen during the dead of winter had mutated into a massive colony-wide witch hunt for an invisible adversary that threatened to tear the society apart. The next phase was lethal because they took raw panic and gave it the stamp of government authority, creating a court with the legal power to execute anyone who didn't fit the mold. Once that confession turned hearsay into hard evidence, the timeline accelerated with a terrifying velocity that no one could control, leading straight to death. Those 3 women were just the appetizers. The demonic hunger grew, the girls kept convulsing, and the screams for blood grew louder and more frequent. The meeting house became a theater of cruelty, where every spasm required a scapegoat and every scream required a victim, causing arrest warrants to spread like a contagious virus. You had folks going to sleep as respected members of the community and waking up to the police kicking down their doors, dragging them off to dungeons. Remember, this initial purge didn't happen in a Supreme Court. It went down in the local church hall, overseen by Hathorne and Corwin men who were making up the rules as they went. These were the movers and shakers, the merchants and politicians who held the keys to power in the region, now wielding the sword of judgment. Neither of them had any experience with capital cases of this nature, but they walked in with their minds made up. The devil was already in the building, and someone had to pay. They weren't there to investigate if a crime occurred that was a foregone conclusion. They were just there to pin it on someone to restore order. Every question they asked, every procedure they followed was rooted in that corrupt assumption that guilt was already established. Hathorne wasn't acting like an impartial judge. He was a headhunter looking for a trophy, demanding a confession rather than seeking actual justice or truth. He did not ask, "Did you hurt these children?" No, he twisted the narrative instantly by asking, "Why do you hurt these children?" It was a loaded trap from the start, and a denial did not reset the conversation. It only dug the grave deeper. To the corrupt authority, a denial simply meant the accused was a liar who needed to be broken down and pressed harder until they complied with the agenda. All around them, the girls performed their chaotic theater. The defendants were forced to stand before the magistrates like sheep before wolves, while the so-called afflicted sat clustered in the front rows, ready to dictate the atmosphere of the room. The second a suspect stepped into view, the programming kicked in. The girls would twist their bodies, shriek in fake agony, and collapse to the floor. If the accused even raised a hand to defend themselves, the girls claimed invisible fingers were pinching them. It was a psychological mirror game. If the accused bit her lip in stress or clenched her fists in frustration, the girls displayed matching marks on their own bodies and blamed the gesture they had just witnessed with their own eyes. The entire room watched this echo effect, hypnotized into believing it was scientific proof that invisible demonic forces were at work, rather than seeing it for the manipulation it truly was. Judge Hathorne did not stop this madness. He encouraged this chaos because it served his purpose. He would stop the proceedings to ask the girls, "Who torments you now?" giving them the floor to destroy lives. He allowed them to point their fingers at the accused and scream in agony, validating their delusions as legal testimony. Their dramatic reactions became a weapon he used to drive the questioning exactly where he wanted it to go. As their importance in the court grew, so did their boldness to accuse anyone they chose. One of the most dangerous tests used in these kangaroo courts appeared simple, almost rational to the untrained eyes of the sheeple watching. An afflicted girl thrashing around in apparent torment would be led toward the accused person. An officer would physically take the accused person's hand and force them to press it against the girl. Almost always, the fit would stop instantly, like a switch being flipped. People in the room saw this pattern repeat again and again and mistook it for divine revelation. They concluded there must be a real invisible connection, a spiritual link that was being broken or reabsorbed by the touch. The ministers explained it away by claiming the evil force sent out by the witch flowed back into its source, on contact like some kind of spiritual magnet. But let's be clear, the touch test proved absolutely nothing about magic. It proved the power of expectation, social pressure, and mass psychosis. But in 1692, it impressed people who were already primed and programmed to believe the lie. Combined with the girl's dramatic fits and Tituba's elaborate coerced confession, it seemed to seal every gap where reasonable doubt might have entered the conversation. Beneath all of this lay the most fatal concept of the entire crisis, something called spectral evidence. This is where the legal system completely left reality behind. The idea was simple and absolutely lethal to justice. A witch, it was believed, could project a spectre, a spirit double wearing their exact shape and face. This spectre could go out and torment victims while the witch's physical body remained elsewhere, completely unaware of what was happening in the spirit realm. Only the victim could see or feel that spectre. No one else in the room could witness it directly, which meant there was no way to verify the claim. If a girl said, "Your spectre is strangling me right now," while the accused stood calmly across the room doing nothing, the magistrates treated her words as a direct factual report from the invisible world. The crucial theological question was whether the devil could impersonate an innocent person to frame them. The Salem magistrates, in their arrogance, accepted the view that he could not. They believed the devil needed permission to wear a human face. Within that twisted framework, if someone claimed to see your spectral shape attacking them, the court assumed you must have given Satan permission to use your form. You were guilty by definition with no way out. Now, some leading ministers outside of Salem were not so certain about this dangerous doctrine. Increase Mather, the most respected preacher in New England, would soon argue that the devil absolutely could appear as a righteous person precisely to trick courts into executing the innocent, a classic satanic inversion. But in the spring of 1692, that more cautious biblical view had not yet gained traction among the zealots running the show. In the meeting house, the harsher, more radical doctrine controlled everything and silenced opposition. A teenager's subjective vision carried more weight than decades of a person's godly reputation and character. This system inverted normal justice, completely turning the concept of innocent until proven guilty into a distant memory. The accused had to prove a negative, which is impossible. They had to prove that their invisible spirit was not doing the things the girls described. No alibi could help you in this trap. You could demonstrate that you were home asleep in your bed, surrounded by 20 witnesses. It did not matter to this court. Your physical body and your spectre were treated as separate entities, allowing the state to convict you based on invisible crimes. Stumbling over the Lord's Prayer under extreme stress, or losing your place while reciting holy words before a hostile crowd became additional signs that you were damned by God. Initially, the people the girls named matched what villagers expected a witch to look like, the usual suspects. They were poor, bitter, strange, or living on the margins of society. But power is intoxicating, and the new authority the afflicted held began to climb the social ladder. The turning point arrived when they aimed their accusations at someone who by every standard appeared respectable, holy, and safe from scrutiny. Martha Corey was a full member of the Salem Village Church, a middle-aged woman known for her sharp intelligence and strong standing in the community. She did not believe the girls' lies. She said so openly. She mocked the examinations and refused to play along with the charade. She warned others that the situation was spiraling out of control. But in a climate of terror and hysteria, that kind of skepticism looked dangerous to the powers that be. It implied the girls might be lying or mistaken, and worse, that the court might be wrong. Soon, Martha Corey herself was named as a witch. During her examination, the girls performed with special fury because she dared to challenge their narrative. When she bit her lip in frustration at the injustice, they screamed that she was biting them. When she wrung her hands in stress, they collapsed, claiming their limbs were being twisted by her invisible power. Hathorne focused on her doubts, treating her skepticism not as wisdom, but as evidence that she was trying to shield the devil's work from being exposed. Her case sent an unmistakable warning to the entire region. Anyone who questioned the proceedings or the authority of the court could be dragged into the pit with the accused. Then came a seismic shockwave that split the spiritual foundation of the community right down the middle. On March 23rd, the spirit of accusation pointed its finger directly at Rebecca Nurse. Now you have to understand who we are talking about here. She was roughly 70 years old, a matriarch and a grandmother firmly planted in a large, highly respected family lineage. She wasn't some unknown entity. She had a lifetime record of piety, steady hard labor, and the kind of neighborly kindness that defined the true believers of that era. To the majority of folks in Salem and the surrounding towns, she was the gold standard, the living proof that a walk of sainthood was actually achievable in this fallen world. Her arrest shook the people who had kept their mouths shut up until that point, waking them up to the reality of the evil taking place. In a bold move against the prevailing narrative, nearly 40 neighbors signed a petition defending her character, essentially begging the court to look at the charges with spiritual discernment and caution. Putting your signature on that document wasn't just a casual gesture, it was an act of courageous warfare against a corrupt system. It placed every single signer in the crosshairs, risking the danger of being associated with witches and targeted by the mob. Yet they did it anyway, which reveals just how insane and outrageous these accusations seemed to the people who actually knew her. When Nurse finally stood trial before a jury, something absolutely remarkable happened in the midst of the hysteria. Despite the demonic manifestations, despite the wild spectral stories being spun, and despite the crushing political pressure to convict, the jurors looked at the facts and first returned a verdict of not guilty. For one brief shining moment, it appeared that a solid reputation, the respect of the community, and basic God-given common sense might actually still carry some weight in the courtroom. But the judges were not satisfied with a verdict that didn't fit their agenda. Chief among them was William Stoughton, a man who would soon head up the special court and drive this persecution forward. He pushed back hard against the decision. The jury was sent back out of the room after the bench highlighted a confusing remark Nurse had made during the proceedings. The truth is, she hadn't heard the question clearly and failed to explain herself, likely because of her advanced age and the sheer exhaustion of the spiritual battle she was in. Under direct intimidation and pressure from the judges, the jurors caved. They reversed their decision and returned with a guilty verdict sealing her fate. The condemnation of Rebecca Nurse sent a terrifying message to the entire colony. It signaled that if a woman of her standing could be found guilty, then absolutely no one was safe from this purge. From that point forward, the floodgates opened and jail cells filled up with people from every level of the social spectrum. Suddenly, old grudges, property disputes, and petty jealousies were weaponized and slipped into testimony. Every unexplained illness, every failed crop, and every dead animal was twisted into part of a witchcraft narrative. By May, the makeshift system of local examinations had completely collapsed under the weight of its own corruption and volume. Dozens of people were sitting in chains in Salem, Boston, and Ipswich waiting for judgment. But Massachusetts was trapped in a strange political limbo with no clear authority. Its old charter had been revoked by the English crown years earlier, leaving a vacuum of power that the enemy was all too happy to exploit. The colony's new royal governor, Sir William Phipps, had just arrived from London carrying a fresh charter to try and stabilize the situation. However, there was still no fully functioning High Court with the legal authority to hear capital cases. Salem had helped create a legal disaster of biblical proportions. With prisoners everywhere and no proper court to try them, Governor Phipps needed to establish order fast. He needed to demonstrate to both the colonists and the Crown that he could manage this crisis effectively. So, he bypassed standard procedure and created a special tribunal designed exclusively for this emergency situation. This was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, established to hear and determine witchcraft cases specifically in Essex County. He appointed some of the colony's most prominent and powerful men to sit as judges over these life and death proceedings. At the head of this tribunal, he placed Lieutenant Governor William Staunton, a rigid, highly educated believer who viewed the Devil's Conspiracy as a genuine military threat that had to be crushed at all costs. Before this new court officially opened its doors, its judges sought spiritual guidance from the leading ministers of the land. Cotton Mather, the brilliant and ambitious preacher from Boston, responded along with his colleagues in a document that became known as the Return of the Ministers. They urged caution in general terms, sounding reasonable on the surface. But they did something crucial that allowed the evil to continue. They did not forbid the use of spectral evidence. They warned against relying on it alone, yet they accepted it as a valid part of the process. That small opening was all the judges needed to drive their agenda. The rules this new court followed essentially guaranteed brutal outcomes for the accused. Spectral testimony visions only the accuser could see was fully permitted. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls were treated as valid hard evidence. Furthermore, confessions were incentivized and rewarded. Those who admitted to witchcraft and named others as co-conspirators were often spared the gallows, while those who maintained their innocence faced certain death. This structure of incentives pushed the terrified accused into a corner where they had to either lie about themselves and others or die with the truth still on their lips. When the Court of Oyer and Terminer convened for the first time on June 2, 1692, they chose their opening case with strategic care. They did not start with Rebecca Nurse because they knew her support in the community remained too strong to challenge right out of the gate. Instead, they chose Bridget Bishop. Bishop lived in Salem town, not the village making her an easier target for the initial prosecution. She was known to wear bright clothing, including a famous red bodice, which stood out in a culture that prized dark, modest dress as a sign of holiness. She was known to argue with her neighbors. On top of that, she had already been accused of witchcraft in the 1680s, even though she was cleared at the time. Stories about her temper and her quarrels had circulated for years, painting a picture that the prosecutors could easily exploit. To many people, she already felt halfway guilty before she ever stepped foot into the courtroom to defend herself. At her trial, prosecutors presented physical evidence, small dolls or poppets found in the wall of a house where she had once lived, all stuck with pins. To people who were steeped in European witch lore, this looked exactly like the kind of dark magic used to inflict harm from a distance. Bishop insisted they were not hers and that someone else must have left them there. But her explanation did not fit the terrifying story the judges and jurors expected to hear, and the narrative of fear drowned out the truth. The authorities completely disregarded any logical reason, choosing instead to embrace the chaos. The performances displayed by these young girls during the proceedings were not just dramatic. They were violent, theatrical manifestations designed to manipulate the emotional atmosphere of the courtroom. The moment Bridget Bishop turned her eyes toward the accusers, they reacted with coordinated hysteria, throwing themselves into violent convulsions. One of them shouted in the middle of the open session that Bishop's spectral form had physically attacked her, driving a pin into her flesh right there in the room. To prove the fabrication, she revealed a physical wound to the gasp of the crowd. To those who had already bought into the delusion, this theater was accepted as undeniable living proof that Bishop was a commander of dark, invisible forces operating from the spiritual realm. For those with spiritual discernment, it was clearly a staged ritual to manufacture consent, but the skeptics were terrified into silence. Yet even facing this wall of manufactured hate, Bishop herself stood like an iron pillar and refused to bow to their intimidation. She looked her accusers in the eye and flatly denied every single charge brought against her. She maintained her integrity, insisting that she had absolutely no knowledge of witchcraft or the dark arts they were trying to pin on her. Her refusal to confess to give the corrupt court the narrative they desperately needed to justify their agenda only solidified their hatred. They viewed her resilience not as innocence, but as the defiance of a hardened soul in league with the enemy. Judge Hathorne, acting as an agent of this broken system, twisted every move she made, interpreting even natural gestures as signs of guilt. The outcome was rigged from the start. Bridget Bishop was declared guilty and sentenced to state-sanctioned execution. This special court, hastily assembled with the specific agenda of purging the community, had finally claimed its first blood sacrifice. The gallows on the high ground stood waiting, a grim monument to fear. The rope was prepared. The authorities knew that once this execution was carried out, the image of state power would be seared into the consciousness of every witness present. This new machinery of death was fully operational. The precedent was set: those labeled as witches could and would be systematically exterminated by the government. With that first body swinging in the wind above Salem, the conversation shifted. It was no longer a question of whether the state would kill again. The real question became how deep the river of blood would flow, and how far the madness would spread before a remnant found the spiritual courage to stand up and stop it. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop found herself standing beneath the shadow of the freshly constructed gallows, the first casualty of a war on the people. The hill overlooking Salem had been stripped of its natural beauty, leaving only the sharp, jagged outline of the wooden frame against the morning sky. It had been only a matter of days since she faced the mockery of a trial. The rapid acceleration from accusation to verdict and finally to death was now complete. There was no mercy, no stay of execution. Crowds from the surrounding towns and villages gathered to watch the spectacle. Religious leaders offered hollow prayers, while government officials read the death warrant aloud, cementing the unholy alliance between the church and the state in this persecution. For years, Bishop's refusal to conform her colorful attire and her willingness to speak her mind had painted a target on her back. Now the system weaponized those very traits, rebranding her individuality as the mark of a hidden demonic evil. When the trapdoor finally swung open and her body plummeted, a fundamental spiritual shift occurred in the atmosphere of New England. The colony had crossed a line of no return, moving from whispers and threats to open public execution carried out in the name of God and the law. The system was no longer dealing in rhetoric. It was now dealing in rope timber and corpses swinging on a hill. The court had drawn first blood, and the beast was nowhere near satisfied. In the weeks that followed Bishop's state-sponsored murder, the judges pushed their agenda forward with relentless speed, refusing to pause for reflection. The jails in Salem, Boston, and Ipswich were bursting at the seams with the accused. The special court processed case after case, feeding the machine. 5 more women were quickly lined up for formal condemnation. Among these targets were Sarah Good, a destitute woman living on the margins, and Rebecca Nurse, a highly respected elderly matriarch, proving that nobody was safe from the lowest beggar to the most upstanding citizen. Sarah Good's trial was a rush to judgment. For years, the villagers had gossiped that her mumbling and complaints were actually curses being cast upon them. Whenever a cow died or a batch of bread failed to rise after she had been turned away from a doorstep, the superstitious locals quietly connected the misfortune to her presence. Once inside the courtroom, those old grudges and suspicions were weaponized as hard evidence. The afflicted girls writhed and screamed in agony whenever Sarah looked their way, continuing the demonic theater. She denied every allegation, but she had no social standing, no property, and no powerful friends to advocate for her against the machine. Her conviction was a foregone conclusion. However, the case of Rebecca Nurse was the true test of the system's depravity. She had a lifetime of charitable works and a legion of defenders standing behind her. Friends and neighbors put their own lives on the line, signing petitions and vouching for her character in a dangerous act of defiance against the court. During her trial, the so-called evidence brought against her was flimsy and riddled with contradictions. Initially, even the jury could see through the deception. They returned a verdict of not guilty. For a brief moment, a flicker of hope illuminated the courtroom, suggesting that sanity might prevail. If a woman like Nurse could be exonerated, perhaps this panic could be contained. Maybe the court would finally draw a boundary line and refuse to condemn the clearly innocent. But then the judges interfered, refusing to accept the verdict. William Staunton and his cohorts bullied the jury, focusing on a confused remark Nurse had allegedly made during the proceedings. Exhausted, struggling with hearing loss, and completely overwhelmed by the pressure, she was unable to give a clear answer when the jurors pressed her for clarification. The bench twisted this silence, framing it as a dark secret. Under direct pressure and intimidation from the judges, the jury was sent back out to reconsider their decision. When they returned to the courtroom this time, the verdict had been flipped: guilty. The system had forced the outcome it wanted. With that reversal, the court demonstrated that even the most sterling reputation could be utterly crushed by the weight of fear and authoritarian power. Nurse Good and 3 other women were sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Their mass execution took place on July 19th. On that dark day, 5 women were carted up to Gallows Hill. The procession moved with a slow, heavy dread. The public watched, driven not just by civic duty, but by a grim, morbid fascination with death. The trials had transformed into the central entertainment and spectacle of the season. At the execution site, a minister named Nicholas Noyes harassed the women, demanding they confess. He promised that a confession was the only way to save their immortal souls. Sarah Good looked him in the eye and refused to play his game. When Noyes pompously declared she was a witch and demanded she admit it, she fired back with a final, cutting prophetic decree. She told him she was no more a witch than he was a wizard, and she warned him that if he took her life, God would force him to drink blood. Years later, when Noyes collapsed and died from a massive internal hemorrhage, choking on his own blood, the people remembered her words and whispered that the curse had been fulfilled. For many who stood there watching that day, seeing the righteous Rebecca Nurse put to death was the moment the horror truly sank in. Standing there with the rough hemp rope tightening around her neck, this was a woman the community had once embraced, trusted, and even loved. The crowd held its breath, many of them desperate for a miracle, searching the skies for a sign that the Almighty would step in and shatter this corrupt system before it was too late. But the heavens remained like brass. No lightning struck, and no angel descended to stop the madness. The trapdoor swung open with a sickening thud, and she was ushered into eternity, just like the others, a brutal reminder that in this fallen world, justice is often delayed. That deafening silence from above sent a dangerous frequency through the colony, a signal that the dark powers interpreted for their own gain. The elite controllers convinced the masses that if God was truly angry with this court, he would have stopped the proceedings, using the silence to validate their tyranny. The judges and the professional accusers took this lack of divine intervention as a stamp of approval on their agenda. And so the next major date of ritual sacrifice, August 19th, brought a figure to the hill who would shake the foundations of their narrative, someone far more shocking than any who had come before. They brought forward Reverend George Burroughs, a former spiritual leader of Salem Village, a man who knew the inner workings of the religious establishment. He had left the area years prior, driven out by bitter financial disputes and a lack of support, with the powerful Putnam family, the local oligarchs, standing as his fiercest opposition. During these sham trials, the so-called afflicted ones claimed his spectre was the ringleader, the general at the center of their satanic gatherings. They were painting him as the head of the dark awakening, the mastermind behind the spiritual assault. The narrative spun by the prosecution was that he possessed supernatural abilities, wielding unnatural strength in the service of the enemy. Classic dehumanization tactics used to justify the elimination of a political target. But as he stood on the gallows staring death in the face, Burroughs did something that the programming of the day said a witch simply could not do. With absolute calm and authority, he recited the Lord's Prayer from Fumashamo. He spoke it word for word, perfect in every syllable, without a single stumble or hesitation. The crowd was visibly shaken to their core because they had been indoctrinated to believe that anyone in league with the darkness would choke on those holy words. Instead of a stuttering servant of darkness, here stood the supposed leader of the devil's army, declaring the sovereignty of God more clearly and fervently than the very ministers condemning him. The people began to weep, the illusion was breaking, and cries to stop, the execution began to rise from the mob. But at that critical tipping point, Cotton Mather, sitting high on his horse like a gatekeeper of the system, intervened to crush the dissent. He shouted down the crowd, reminding them of the theological loophole that Satan himself could transform and appear as an angel of light to deceive the elect. He warned them not to trust their own eyes or the outward display of righteousness when it contradicted the lawful judgment of the court. His voice, his elite status, and his manipulative timing shoved the crowd back into submission, turning the momentum back toward death. Burroughs was hanged, his protests silenced, and through the scorching heat of the rest of that summer, the machine of death continued to grind forward. By the end of the purge, 19 people, 14 women and 5 men were publicly executed as witches, while several others rotted away and perished in the filthy, overcrowded dungeons of the state. Every time the gallows claimed another victim, the fear in the community spiked, but simultaneously the blind trust in the authority began to erode, chipping away at the control grid. With every respected citizen that was murdered by the state, more people began to wake up whispering in the shadows that something had gone terribly demonically wrong with the leadership. Then came a death that made even the most hardened supporters of the narrative tremble. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer who refused to play their game, was not hanged like the rest. He was slowly crushed to death. Giles Corey was a man of the old breed, stubborn, quarrelsome, and completely unwilling to bow to a corrupt authority. In the beginning, when the accusations first started, he had actually testified against his own wife Martha, unwittingly aiding the prosecution before he realized the true nature of the beast he was dealing with. But after she was condemned, and he saw the system turn its gaze toward him, he realized that there was no justice to be found in a court that had already decided the verdict. Under the English law of the time, a prisoner had to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, before the case could proceed to a jury, and crucially before the state could legally seize the property of a convicted felon. Corey saw the trap and refused to plead. By standing completely silent, he threw a wrench into the gears of their legal machinery, blocking the entire process from moving forward. He knew that if they could not legally try him, they could not legally confiscate his farm and leave his family destitute after the inevitable conviction. He may have been old, but he was not foolish. He chose to endure unimaginable pain to protect his children's inheritance from the greedy hands of the government. But the law had a brutal workaround for this kind of resistance. They called it peine forte durée, strong and hard punishment designed to force compliance through torture. In practice, this was state-sanctioned torture by pressing. In a field near the jail that September, they stripped the old man and staked him to the ground, face up to the sky. A heavy wooden board was placed across his chest, and heavy stones were added one by one, slowly increasing the pressure over hours that turned into agonized days. Officials and religious leaders came to him repeatedly, urging him to just speak, to enter a plea and end the suffering. But he refused to give the system what it wanted. When they asked him again and again to submit to their authority, he gasped out only 2 words of absolute defiance: more weight. Whether those were his exact final words or the legend of a martyr, the fact remains that he never entered a plea. He never gave the court the legal foothold or the consent they needed to steal his legacy. After 2 days of slow, crushing torture, he died beneath the stones. But he won the war, his land passed to his heirs, and the government didn't get a single acre. Corey's death hit differently than the others. The hangings were dressed up as lawful executions, sanitized by the court's decree, but the pressing was raw, visible torture. It felt like a relic from a darker, more barbaric era, stripping away the veneer of civilization from the colony. Witnesses were forced to watch an 81-year-old man slowly crushed into the earth, simply because he refused to speak the words the government demanded. Even in that harsh society, this shocked the collective conscience. It exposed the sheer cruelty at the core of the system in a way that no amount of religious rhetoric could cover up. As the body count rose and the doubts multiplied, the pressure on the court began to intensify from a new direction. The colony's own intellectual and religious leadership began to fracture. Increase Mather, the president of Harvard College and one of the most powerful voices in New England, returned from England right in the middle of this spiritual and political crisis. He reviewed the reports of how the trials were being conducted in Salem and grew deeply disturbed by the court's reliance on spectral evidence visions that only the accusers could see. Now, Mather was a believer. He strongly believed in the reality of witchcraft and the spiritual war, but he also believed in divine order and legal limits. In a manuscript that would soon be published as Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, he drew a line in the sand. He argued that no person should ever be condemned to death based solely on spectral testimony, evidence that could not be verified by objective reality. He emphasized that both biblical scripture and civil law required solid observable evidence and the testimony of at least 2 credible witnesses before taking a life. He warned the people that the devil is a master of deception and could easily exploit the court's trust in these visions appearing in the likeness of innocent people to trick the judges into murdering the righteous. This revelation didn't just scratch the surface. It was a sword of truth, plunging straight into the dark heart of the entire Salem operation, exposing the deception at its core. You see, the logic was undeniable. If the adversary, the father of lies, has the power to masquerade as an angel of light or mimic the appearance of the righteous, then a specter appearing in the likeness of a person proves absolutely nothing about that person's soul. Those so-called visions the girls were having, which the people had foolishly accepted as a direct live stream from the spiritual realm, were finally exposed for what they truly were: a corrupted, unreliable frequency sent to confuse the masses. And isn't it just like the nature of wickedness to go too far? At that exact moment, the accusers got drunk on their own power and started reaching for targets that were way out of their league, exposing their own agenda. They played the game strategically, at first targeting the marginalized, the outcasts, the people society rejected. Then they moved on to the respected elders and even a former minister. But their pride swelled and they aimed their arrows at the very top of the hierarchy. The audacity was off the charts. They actually pointed the finger at the wife of Reverend John Hale of Beverly, the very man who had been propping up this corrupt court and defending its wicked works from the pulpit. Then the whispers turned into a roar as they dragged the name of Lady Mary Phipps into the mud, claiming the governor's own wife was entangled in this deep conspiracy of darkness. All of a sudden, this witch hunt wasn't just a convenient tool to destroy enemies and steal land from the common folk. It was banging on the front doors of the establishment, threatening to burn down the ivory towers of the colony's rulers. Reverend Hale was shook to his spirit. It is funny how people stay silent about injustice until it knocks on their own door. But now that the accusation touched his own flesh and blood, he had to rethink every single thing he had witnessed. Years down the line, after the dust had settled and the truth came out, he would pen a modest, reflective inquiry into the true nature of witchcraft and spiritual operations. It was a heavy, painful reality check, a confession of the gross errors he and the others had fallen into. But for Governor William Phipps, the moment the rumors touched his wife, that was the final straw, the absolute breaking point. Those trials, which he initially used to project an image of high energy and control over the colony, had flipped on him. They transformed from a political asset into a dangerous liability that threatened to tear down his entire administration. So, equipping himself with the theological breakdown provided by Increase Mather and watching the accusers try to strike upward at the political elite, Phipps decided it was time to step in and shut the system down. On October 29, 1692, he issued the executive order to suspend the court of Oyer and Terminer, completely forbidding any more arrests based on that shady spectral evidence. Staunton was absolutely livid, filled with a religious rage because his power trip was being cut short by the higher-ups. He was convinced the court was on the brink of completing some holy crusade, and he viewed the governor's intervention as a direct blockage of what he thought was God's plan, so he stormed off the bench in a fit of pride. But all that anger and huffing and puffing didn't change a thing. That special court was dead in the water, and just like that, the false accusations evaporated into thin air almost overnight. Without a corrupt judicial system to validate them and give them a platform, the girls' dramatic fits and performances lost their main stage and their captivated audience. The very same communities that had once lifted these girls up as prophets and seers now looked at them with side-eye suspicion and straight-up irritation. The demonic energy driving the movement collapsed, but the society was left with the messy reality of what to do with all the people still rotting away in the prison cells. Come January 1693, they set up a new regular high court called the Superior Court of Judicature to take over from the emergency tribunal. But this time the rules of engagement were completely different. They threw out the spectral evidence entirely. The judges started demanding hard, concrete proof, actual facts, not some invisible visions or spooky stories about dreams and shadows. The so-called afflicted girls still tried to show up at some of the trials, but their words had lost their anointing and could no longer secure a conviction. Under this righteous standard, the cases fell apart one after another. The grand juries finally woke up to the truth and refused to hand down indictments when the only serious charge on the table was based on spectral nonsense. Trial juries started acquitting people left and right. Out of dozens of folks who had been locked up for months suffering in chains, only a tiny handful were actually found guilty. And even for those few, Governor Phipps wasted no time issuing reprieves. The bloodshed stopped. There were no more state-sponsored executions for witchcraft in Massachusetts after September 1692. By May 1693, Phipps signed a broad pardon releasing all the remaining prisoners and officially closing the book on the legal chapter of this nightmare. The state machinery had stopped the physical killing, but make no mistake, they hadn't undone the deep, catastrophic damage they inflicted on the people's spirits and livelihoods. You have to understand, walking out of those jail cells didn't mean they got a fresh start. The system made sure they were still in bondage. Under those wicked colonial rules, the prisoners were forced to pay for their own imprisonment, their food, their bedding, even the shackles that held them. Before they could leave, the guards and sheriffs demanded their fees like extortionists. So many families already completely devastated by months of lost labor, and piling legal fees had absolutely nothing left to give to the system. Some had already sold off their family land and their livestock just to keep breathing. To clear these final debts and buy their freedom, they had to sell whatever scraps they had left. It was so twisted that in some cases people who had been declared innocent and free had to stay in jail simply because they couldn't afford the price tag the state put on their exit. The social fabric of the community was just as destroyed. The meeting house, which was supposed to be a place of Sunday worship and holiness, had been turned into the main theater for these wicked examinations. Now the people had to sit on the very benches where they had watched their neighbors get accused, humiliated, and condemned to death by the congregation. Families who had turned on each other and testified against their own blood had to sit there and share the same communion table like nothing had happened. Pastors and ministers who had pushed for the court's support had to stand up and preach to the widows and orphans created by the very executions they had endorsed. And as for the afflicted girls who were once the center of attention and celebrity in the colony, they were now largely disgraced and looked down upon by the masses. Their influence and power evaporated just as fast as it had arrived. Many of them eventually got married and moved far away to hide from the shame of what they caused. But one of them, Anne Putnam Jr., stayed in the region and carried the heavy burden of her sins. In 1706, as a grown woman, she stood before the congregation and publicly begged for forgiveness. She claimed she had been deceived by the great deluder Satan himself, but she also took responsibility and admitted her own guilt in shedding the blood of innocent people. Her confession stands as one of the most lucid personal acknowledgments of wrongdoing to ever come out of the Salem wreckage. But at the government level, the road to apology was slow and half-hearted. It wasn't until 1697 that the colony finally declared a day of fasting and prayer to mourn the tragedy they caused. They caused our shores. On that specific day, Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the judges from the court of Oyer and Termina, stood up in Boston's South Church and had his minister read a statement of repentance to the people. He openly confessed his grievous errors during the trials and pleaded with the Most High not to punish the entire colony for the sins and bloodshed he had helped commit. One man alone possessed the spiritual fortitude to spend his remaining years in a posture of genuine public contrition, bowing before God for the blood on his hands. Yet looking at the other magistrates and high-ranking officials of that dark era, we see a chilling arrogance that refused to bend a stubborn pride that defines corrupt leadership to this very day. Take William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, a man who epitomized the cold heart of the system. He went to his grave without ever publicly admitting he was wrong, embodying the spirit of Pharaoh, hardened, unyielding, and utterly convinced of his own righteous authority despite the carnage he caused. Then you have Cotton Mather, the intellectual architect of this chaos, who never truly owned his role in legitimizing spectral evidence, essentially the fake news of the 17th century. He tried to rewrite history, pivoting to emphasize his few warnings while conveniently ignoring how his influence fueled the fire, a classic move by the elite to evade accountability. But you cannot simply wash away the stain of innocent blood with silence or revisionist history. For decades following the trials, the families of those lynched by the state did not rest. They rose up demanding justice and refusing to let the colony forget the systemic murder committed under the guise of law and order. These families filed petition after petition, demanding not just an apology, but financial compensation and the formal clearing of their family names, a historic fight for reparations that mirrors the struggle for justice we still see playing out in 2026. Finally, the government was forced to listen. In the year 1711, the colonial legislature passed a bill reversing many of the attainders and granting modest restitution to some families, an admission that the state had failed its citizens, though the payout was a pittance compared to the generational trauma inflicted. Yet, as is always the case when man tries to fix what he has broken, the process was messy, bureaucratic, and woefully incomplete, leaving many wounds wide open. The state's attempt at restoration fell short. Not every victim was named in the bill, and some descendants were forced to wait generations for their ancestors to be fully exonerated, proving that the wheels of justice grind slowly when they are turning against the establishment. By the time some measure of truth came to light, the generation that survived the terror of 1692 was largely gone buried in the soil. However, the truth could not be buried with them. It survived in the sermons of repentant pastors, in private letters, and in the secret diaries that documented the colony's descent into madness. Salem stands today as a prophetic warning for our time, a blueprint of destruction showing exactly what happens when you combine fear-mongering, twisted theology, a weaponized legal system, and community resentments into a perfect storm of persecution. The very community that arrogantly believed it was purging evil and sanctifying itself through these executions was forced to confront the horrifying reality that they had become the agents of darkness they claimed to be fighting. They had not cleansed the land. They had defiled it, staining their souls and their soil with the innocent blood of their own neighbors, a guilt that biblical law tells us does not wash away easily. We must understand that the Salem witch trials were not just some random outbreak of hysteria or confusion. They were the calculated result of specific choices made by people in power operating within a culture ripe for exploitation and spiritual abuse. It was a village fractured by internal feuds and greed, sitting in a colony traumatized by brutal frontier wars. A society living in fear, which makes it the perfect breeding ground for authoritarian overreach. They constructed a harsh religious system that saw demons around every corner and built a legal framework that accepted spectral evidence, visions, and dreams over hard facts, much like how modern narratives often prioritize feelings and agendas over objective truth. The leadership was driven by a terrified pragmatism, fearing the existence of a single witch in their midst, more than they feared the divine judgment of murdering 20 innocent human beings, a utilitarian ethics that sacrifices the individual for the so-called safety of the collective. Once they crossed the line and Bridget Bishop's body was left swinging on Gallows Hill, the court trapped itself. To admit doubt at that point would be to admit to murder, so they doubled down on their error. With every new execution, every new hanging, they locked themselves deeper into their own false narrative, unable to turn back without destroying their own legitimacy and power structure. It wasn't until the accusations started aiming at the elite, the governor's own wife, and the public witnessed the gruesome, unshakable resolve of martyrs like Giles Corey that the spell of deception finally shattered and the hysteria lost its momentum. The profound tragedy of Salem lies in the fact that wisdom was only gained after the slaughter. They learnt the value of due process only after they had destroyed the lives of the innocent, a lesson we seem dangerously close to needing to learn again in 2026. The rigorous rules of evidence, the skepticism toward unverifiable claims, and the distrust of courts that presume guilt, these pillars of liberty, were fortified in America, specifically because the people remembered the horrors of what happened when justice failed in 1692. But let us never forget that the price for this legal wisdom was paid in blood, 20 souls sent to their graves, and countless families scarred forever by a government that lost its moral compass. If you have journeyed with us this far, I appreciate your diligence in seeking the truth behind the official story and staying engaged until the very end. If you are hungry for more unvarnished investigations into history's darkest chapters and the spiritual lessons they hold for us today, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and hit that like button to help spread the truth. Share this revelation with someone who thinks they know the story of Salem but is missing the deeper reality of how power, fear, and corruption operate. This is the place where we uncover what the history books try to hide. Stay vigilant because there are many more forbidden stories waiting to be unearthed in our next broadcast.